Sarah's 18th birthday arrived with the same bitter cold that had gripped their small mountain town for weeks. She stood by the frosted window of her childhood bedroom, watching her breath form clouds in the frigid air. The old farmhouse never held heat well, but today the chill seemed to seep into her bones in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. Her parents sat downstairs at the kitchen table, their voices carrying up through the thin floorboards, the same hushed, urgent tones they'd been using for months whenever they thought she couldn't hear. Money troubles, they always said when she asked. The farm wasn't producing like it used to. Medical bills from her mother's surgery last spring had piled up like autumn leaves, and winter was always the hardest season. But Sarah knew it was more than that. She'd seen the official-looking letters that arrived weekly, the ones her father would quickly stuff into his jacket pocket when she entered the room. She'd noticed how her mother's eyes would dart away whenever certain topics came up, and lately there had been phone calls. Quiet conversations that ended abruptly when she walked into the room. The wooden stairs creaked under her feet as she descended for breakfast. Her parents looked up with forced smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Her mother had prepared pancakes, Sarah's favorite, but the gesture felt heavy with unspoken meaning. They ate in relative silence, the scraping of forks against plates unnaturally loud in the small kitchen. "We need to talk to you about something important," her father finally said, setting down his coffee cup with shaking hands. He was a man who had worked the land his entire life, his hands rough and calloused, but now they trembled like autumn leaves in the wind. Sarah's stomach dropped. She had been expecting this conversation for weeks, maybe months. The signs had all been there, building like storm clouds on the horizon. The whispered phone calls, the visits from strangers in expensive cars, the way her parents would fall silent whenever she entered a room. Her mother reached across the table and took her hand. "You know we love you more than anything in this world," she began, her voice cracking slightly. "Everything we've ever done has been to try to give you the best life possible." The words that followed seemed to come from a great distance, as if Sarah were hearing them through water. An arrangement had been made, her father explained. A man from the Modoc reservation, a widower who had lost his wife in childbirth just 6 months ago, leaving him alone with twin babies. He was a good man, they assured her, respected in his community with means to provide for a family. Thomas Hawk Feather was his name, and he was 35 years old. He worked for the tribal council and owned a successful construction business that employed dozens of men from the reservation. He lived in a large house at the edge of the forest with modern conveniences and everything a young woman could need. Most importantly, he was looking for a wife to help him raise his children. Sarah's world tilted on its axis. The pancakes she had eaten turned to lead in her stomach, as the reality of what her parents were telling her began to sink in. They had arranged her marriage. In exchange, their debts would be paid, the farm would be saved, and they could start fresh. The man had already provided a substantial sum as proof of his serious intentions. "He's a good man," her mother repeated, as if saying it enough times would make it true. "He'll treat you well. And the babies need a mother figure. You've always been so good with children." Sarah thought of the times she had babysat for neighbors, how the little ones would cling to her when their parents returned. She did love children, had always imagined having a house full of them someday. But not like this, not as part of a business transaction that would take her away from everything she had ever known. The photographs her father produced from his jacket pocket showed a man with kind eyes and strong features. Thomas Hawk Feather had straight black hair that touched his shoulders and wore traditional beaded jewelry alongside a modern business suit. In one picture, he held 2 tiny babies, his large hands gentle as he cradled them against his chest. The babies were beautiful, with dark hair and round cheeks, but they looked so small and vulnerable. "He lost his wife during the delivery," her mother explained softly. "She was young like you. The baby survived, but he's been struggling to care for them on his own. His mother helps when she can, but she's getting older. He needs someone young and strong to help him raise them properly." Questions tumbled through Sarah's mind faster than she could voice them. Why her? How had her parents even met this man? What would happen if she refused? But when she looked at her parents' faces, she saw desperation there. Real fear they weren't doing this to hurt her. They were drowning, and this was the only lifeline they could find. Her father cleared his throat and pulled out another envelope. "He wanted you to have this," he said, sliding it across the table, "so you could buy things you might need." Clothes, books, whatever would make you comfortable. Inside was more money than Sarah had ever seen at one time. Bills crisp and new, smelling like the bank. It felt wrong in her hands, like payment for something she hadn't agreed to sell. But it also represented security, something her family had been without for too long. "When?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Next week," her mother answered. "He'll come to get you next week. You'll have a small ceremony at the courthouse just to make it official, and then you'll go home with him to the reservation." Home. The word felt foreign when applied to anywhere but this drafty farmhouse with its creaking floors and leaky roof. But this place, for all its faults, was where she had grown up, where she had learned to walk, to read, to dream about her future. A future that apparently had been decided for her while she slept. The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparations and difficult conversations. Her mother helped her sort through her belongings, deciding what to pack and what to leave behind. They folded her dresses carefully, wrapping her few pieces of jewelry in soft cloth. Her books were the hardest to choose from, but her mother assured her that Thomas had said she could bring as many as she wanted. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Sarah stood once again at her bedroom window. In 1 week, she would be married to a man she had never met, living in a place she had never seen, caring for children who had never known their birth mother. The weight of it all settled on her shoulders like a heavy cloak, but beneath the fear and uncertainty she found something unexpected, a small spark of curiosity about what this new life might hold. The courthouse in the county seat was smaller than Sarah had imagined, a squat brick building that looked like it had been constructed during the Great Depression and hadn't been updated since. She wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton that her mother had sewn for her high school graduation just 6 months earlier. It felt strange to be wearing it for her wedding, even if this ceremony bore no resemblance to the church wedding she had dreamed of as a little girl. Thomas Hawk Feather arrived exactly on time. Driving a clean pickup truck that looked almost new, Sarah watched from the courthouse steps as he parked and walked toward them, his stride confident but unhurried. He was taller than she had expected from the photographs, with broad shoulders that filled out his dark suit jacket. When he reached the group, he nodded respectfully to her parents before turning his attention to her. "Sarah," he said, his voice deep and steady, "I'm grateful you agreed to this arrangement. I know it's not easy." His honesty caught her off guard. She had expected polite pleasantries, maybe some attempt to pretend this was a normal courtship. Instead, he acknowledged the unusual nature of their situation with a directness that was somehow both unsettling and reassuring. "I brought pictures of the babies," he continued, pulling out his wallet. "I thought you might want to see more recent ones." The photographs showed 2 healthy infants who couldn't have been more than 7 months old. One was sleeping peacefully, tiny fist curled against a chubby cheek. The other was awake, dark eyes bright and alert, reaching toward the camera with curious fingers. "This is Emma," Thomas said, pointing to the sleeping baby. "She's usually the quiet one. And this is Jake. He's more adventurous, always trying to crawl away when I'm changing him." Emma and Jake, real names for real children who would soon become her responsibility. The weight of it settled on her chest like a heavy stone. These weren't just babies in a photograph anymore. They were individuals with personalities, needs, and a father who loved them enough to marry a stranger to ensure they had proper care. The ceremony itself lasted less than 10 minutes. A tired-looking judge read the required words while Sarah's parents and Thomas's uncle served as witnesses. When it came time to exchange rings, Thomas produced a simple gold band that fit perfectly on her finger. She wondered how he had known her size, then realized her father must have provided that information along with everything else. "You may kiss the bride," the judge said, with practiced indifference. Thomas looked at her questioningly, and Sarah nodded slightly. His kiss was brief and respectful, barely more than a brush of lips against lips. It was her first kiss, though she didn't tell him that. There would be time for such revelations later, if there ever was a later when such personal details mattered. The ride to the reservation took 2 hours through winding mountain roads. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, watching familiar landscape give way to territory she had never seen. Thomas drove carefully, occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing bits of history about the area. He seemed to understand that she needed time to absorb everything that was happening. "My grandmother will want to meet you, properly," he said as they passed. through a small town that marked the halfway point of their journey. She's the one who's been helping with the babies, but her arthritis has been getting worse. She can't lift them as much as she used to. Sarah nodded, though her throat felt too tight to speak. She was thinking about her own grandmother, who had passed away when Sarah was 12. Gran had been the one to teach her to bake bread, to tend a garden, to understand that sometimes life required you to be stronger than you felt ready to be. The Modoc reservation appeared gradually, marked not by signs or boundaries but by a subtle shift in the landscape and architecture. Houses became more spread out, many incorporating traditional design elements alongside modern conveniences. Children played in yards watched over by elders sitting on porches, and Sarah caught glimpses of people working in gardens and tending to animals. Thomas's house was larger than she had expected, a 2-story structure with a wide front porch and large windows that let in plenty of natural light. It was painted white with blue trim, and flower beds that had been prepared for spring planting lined the walkway. This was where she would live now, where she would raise children and build whatever kind of life was possible under these circumstances. His grandmother met them at the door, a small woman with silver-streaked hair braided down her back and eyes that seemed to see everything. She looked Sarah up and down with the assessing gaze of someone who had raised many children and knew the difference between those who could handle responsibility and those who would crumble under pressure. "So, you're the girl who's going to help with our babies," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that made the words sound like music. "They're good children, but they need consistency. Their mother's loss hit them hard, even as young as they are." She led them inside to where Emma and Jake were sleeping in matching cribs in what had obviously been prepared as a nursery. The room was painted pale yellow, with stuffed animals arranged on shelves and a rocking chair positioned by the window. Someone had clearly put thought and care into making this space welcoming for children. Emma stirred as they entered, opening dark eyes that immediately focused on Thomas. She made small cooing sounds and reached up with tiny fingers, clearly recognizing her father. Jake continued sleeping, but even in sleep his resemblance to Thomas was unmistakable. "They're beautiful," Sarah whispered, the first words she had spoken since leaving the courthouse. Thomas lifted Emma from her crib, and she settled against his chest with the easy contentment of a child who felt completely secure. "Would you like to hold her?" he asked. Sarah's arms felt clumsy at first, but Emma seemed to approve of the transfer, studying Sarah's face with the serious curiosity that very young children bring to new experiences. Her weight was warm and solid, a reminder that this was real. These children, this house, this new life were all real. The rest of the day passed in a series of practical lessons. Thomas showed her where everything was kept, from diapers and formula to the baby's favorite toys and blankets. His grandmother demonstrated how each child preferred to be fed and soothed, sharing the kind of detailed knowledge that came from months of careful observation. "Emma likes to be held while she takes her bottle," the older woman explained, "but Jake prefers to be propped up so he can see what's going on around him. They're twins, but they're completely different people already." As evening approached, Thomas's grandmother prepared to leave for her own home just down the road. She hugged both babies goodbye and then surprised Sarah by pulling her into a brief but warm embrace. "You have kind eyes," she said quietly. "That's what they need most right now. Someone who will look at them and see children worth loving, not just work to be done." After she left, the house fell into a comfortable quiet. Thomas prepared dinner while Sarah played with the babies on a blanket spread across the living room floor. Emma was content to lie on her back and grab at colorful toys suspended above her, while Jake showed early signs of mobility, rolling and squirming as if planning his escape route. They ate dinner together, their first meal as a family, with the babies in high chairs between them. It was surreal and ordinary at the same time, like playing house except with real consequences and real responsibility. Thomas asked about her interests, her education, her plans before this arrangement had changed everything. "I was going to apply to the state college," she told him. "I wanted to study literature, maybe become a teacher." "There's no reason you can't still do that," he said, surprising her. "Maybe not right away, but when the children are older. Education is important." That night, Sarah lay in the guest room that had been prepared for her, listening to the sounds of an unfamiliar house settling around her. Down the hall, she could hear Thomas moving quietly as he checked on the babies one final time before bed. Through the window, she could see stars that seemed brighter and more numerous than they had ever appeared from her childhood bedroom. She was married now, to a man she had known for less than 12 hours. She was responsible for 2 babies who had never known any mother, except the one they had lost. She was living in a place where she knew no one except her new husband and his grandmother. Everything about her life had changed in a single day, and she had no idea what tomorrow would bring. The first month of marriage passed like learning a complex dance with a partner she barely knew. Sarah discovered that Thomas was a man of routines, rising before dawn to check on the babies before heading to work. He would leave detailed notes about feeding schedules and appointments, along with phone numbers where he could be reached in case of emergencies. His consideration was methodical, practical, but it showed a thoughtfulness that surprised her. The babies responded to her presence with the adaptability of the very young. Emma became particularly attached to Sarah's voice, calming quickly when Sarah sang the lullabies her own mother had used. Jake showed his approval through smiles and giggles, especially when Sarah played peekaboo games that made him squeal with delight. These small victories felt enormous during those early weeks when everything else seemed uncertain. Thomas's grandmother, who insisted Sarah call her Nana Rose, became an unexpected ally and teacher. She would arrive most mornings after Thomas left for work, bringing fresh bread or vegetables from her garden. While they tended to the babies together, she shared stories about the reservation, its history, and the extended network of families that formed the community. "Your husband is well respected here," Nana Rose told her one morning as they folded tiny clothes together. After his first wife died, many people worried he would leave, maybe move to the city where he could forget his grief. But he stayed. He said the children needed to know where they came from. Sarah learned that Thomas's first wife, Maria, had been beloved in the community. She had taught at the reservation school and helped organize cultural events that brought families together. Her death had left not just Thomas and the babies bereft, but an entire community that had looked to her for leadership and inspiration. "She would have liked you," Nana Rose added quietly. Maria believed that love could grow anywhere if the ground was prepared with respect and kindness. The weight of following in such footsteps felt overwhelming at times. Sarah would catch herself wondering what Maria would have done in various situations, how she would have arranged the nursery differently, what songs she would have sung to soothe fussy babies. The ghost of the perfect first wife seemed to hover over everything, a standard Sarah feared she could never meet. 3 weeks into the marriage, Jake developed a fever that sent Sarah into a panic. She called Thomas at work, her voice shaking as she described the symptoms. He arrived home within 20 minutes, calm but clearly concerned, and together they took Jake to the reservation clinic. The doctor, a young woman who had grown up on the reservation before attending medical school in the city, examined Jake thoroughly and pronounced it a common cold that would pass with rest and plenty of fluids. "First-time parent nerves," she told Sarah kindly as they prepared to leave. "You did exactly the right thing by calling. Better to be cautious with babies this young." On the drive home, Thomas reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand briefly. "Thank you for caring about them so much," he said. "I know this isn't the life you planned, but they're lucky to have you." It was the first time he had acknowledged the sacrifice she had made, and his words brought unexpected tears to her eyes. She was beginning to understand that this arrangement, which had felt so cold and businesslike at first, was built on multiple layers of need and hope. Thomas needed help raising his children. The babies needed consistent care and love. And she, though she was still figuring it out, needed to feel useful and valued in ways her old life had never provided. The community gradually began to accept her presence. Women at the grocery store would nod politely and ask about the babies. Children playing in the park would wave when she pushed the stroller past. An elderly man who worked at the gas station began saving pieces of interesting wood for Thomas, knowing he enjoyed carving toys for the children in his spare time. But acceptance and belonging were 2 different things, Sarah learned. She remained an outsider, the white girl who had married into the community under unusual circumstances. Some people were genuinely welcoming, while others maintained a polite distance that made it clear she would need to prove herself over time. She understood their caution. Trust had to be earned, especially when it came to the care of motherless children. One evening, as she was preparing dinner while the babies napped, Sarah found herself studying her reflection in the kitchen window. The woman looking back at her had changed in subtle ways over the past month. Her posture was different, more confident in some ways but also more careful. Her hands moved with the efficiency that came from constant childcare. She looked older, or maybe just more serious, as if responsibility had settled into her features and made itself at home. Thomas arrived home that evening with news that both excited and terrified her. The tribal council was planning a traditional blessing ceremony for the babies, something that had been postponed after Maria's death, but was now being planned for the following month. It would be their formal introduction to the community as members of the tribe, with Sarah participating as their mother figure. "You don't have to do anything special," Thomas assured her when he saw her worried expression. "Just be present and let the elders welcome you and the children. It's important that Emma and Jake know they belong here, that they have a community that will support them as they grow up." The ceremony would involve traditional dress, which meant Sarah would need to learn about appropriate clothing and customs. Nana Rose volunteered to help, and over the next few days, she taught Sarah about the significance of different patterns and colors, the proper way to arrange her hair, and the basic etiquette expected during sacred gatherings. "It's not about being perfect," Nana Rose emphasized as she showed Sarah how to braid ribbons into her hair. "It's about showing respect and willingness to learn. The community will see that and respond accordingly." As the day of the ceremony approached, Sarah found herself spending long hours in the nursery, watching Emma and Jake sleep and trying to imagine their futures. These children would grow up knowing they were wanted and loved, surrounded by a community that valued their heritage and supported their development. In some ways, they would have advantages she had never had, even if they would also carry the sadness of never knowing their birth mother. Thomas began staying home more in the evenings, helping with bedtime routines and spending time teaching Sarah about his work and interests. He showed her the wooden toys he carved, each one carefully shaped and sanded smooth for small hands to explore safely. His attention to detail in everything he did impressed her, from the way he maintained their home to the patience he showed when the babies were fussy or difficult. "My grandfather taught me that anything worth doing is worth doing well," he explained, one evening as he put finishing touches on a small wooden horse. "Children notice quality, even when they're too young to understand it. They know when something is made with love." Sarah began to understand that this philosophy extended to their marriage as well. Thomas was approaching their relationship with the same careful attention he brought to his woodworking and his parenting. He was building something meant to last, taking time to ensure each element was strong and properly fitted before moving on to the next step. The night before the ceremony, Sarah lay awake listening to the sounds of the house around her. Down the hall, she could hear Thomas moving around quietly, probably checking on the babies one final time before bed. Outside, wind moved through the trees with a sound like whispered conversations. For the first time since arriving on the reservation, she felt something that might have been the beginning of belonging. Tomorrow, she would stand before Thomas's community and accept responsibility not just for two babies, but for becoming part of something larger than herself. The scared 18-year-old girl who had signed papers at the courthouse felt like someone from another lifetime. In her place was a woman who was learning to find strength she hadn't known she possessed, and love that was growing in the spaces between duty and choice. The blessing ceremony took place on a crisp morning, when autumn was just beginning to touch the edges of the leaves. Sarah wore a traditional dress that Nana Rose had sewn for her, deep blue with intricate beadwork that had taken weeks to complete. The weight of the beads against her shoulders felt significant, like wearing someone else's history and hoping to prove worthy of it. Emma and Jake were dressed in matching outfits, tiny versions of traditional clothing that made them look like living dolls. Emma seemed fascinated by the new textures and colors, running her small fingers along the soft leather and smooth beads. Jake was more interested in trying to put everything in his mouth, requiring constant vigilance to prevent him from swallowing anything dangerous. The ceremony itself was both more elaborate and more intimate than Sarah had expected. The entire community gathered in a circle around the tribal council building, with elders positioned in places of honor and children scattered throughout, some playing quietly while others watched the proceedings with solemn attention. Thomas stood beside her, wearing traditional dress that transformed him from the businessman she knew into someone who seemed to carry the weight of generations. Elder Joseph, the spiritual leader of the community, spoke in the Modoc language before switching to English for Sarah's benefit. His words wove together the story of the baby's birth, their mother's death, and Thomas's journey through grief toward this new beginning. When he spoke about Sarah, he called her the one who came to heal, a description that made her throat tight with emotion and responsibility. These children lost their mother before they could know her voice. Elder Joseph continued, his weathered hands resting gently on Emma's head while she dozed in Sarah's arms. But the Creator does not leave children without mothers. Sometimes love comes in unexpected ways, through people who choose to open their hearts even when their own lives are changing. The blessing itself involved sage smoke, prayers in multiple languages, and the presentation of gifts from various community members. Sarah received a pair of beaded earrings from the women's circle, a hand-woven blanket from the elders, and a small carved bear from a group of children who solemnly explained that it would protect the babies from nightmares. But it was the moment when Elder Joseph placed his hands on both Sarah and Thomas, declaring them officially recognized as a family unit within the tribal structure, that something fundamental shifted inside her. The words weren't just ceremonial. They created a bond that went beyond the legal papers signed at the courthouse, connecting her to a community and a way of life that stretched back generations. After the formal ceremony, the celebration moved to the community hall where tables groaned under the weight of traditional foods and family recipes. Sarah found herself passed from group to group, each wanting to meet the new mother and share advice about raising children on the reservation. The overwhelming attention was both exhausting and heartwarming, proof that Emma and Jake would grow up surrounded by people who cared about their well-being. Thomas's aunt, a woman named Carol who managed the tribal health clinic, pulled Sarah aside during the festivities. "I knew Maria since we were children," she said directly, her tone neither unkind nor particularly warm. "She was special and everyone here loved her. I want you to know that no one expects you to replace her or be exactly like her." Sarah nodded, grateful for the honesty even though it stung slightly. But, Carol continued, "These babies need consistency and love, and Thomas needs a partner who will stay committed when things get difficult. Are you prepared for that reality? This isn't a fairy tale. It's two broken people trying to build something good for the sake of children who deserve better than what life has given them so far." The question haunted Sarah over the following weeks as she settled more fully into her role. The initial period of adjustment was ending, and the day-to-day reality of her new life was becoming clear. Thomas left for work each morning with a kiss on her forehead that felt more like gratitude than passion. She spent her days in a routine of feeding schedules, diaper changes, and the countless small tasks that kept a household functioning. But within this routine, small moments of genuine connection began to emerge. Thomas would come home from work and immediately seek out the babies, his face transforming with pure joy when they reached for him. He began asking Sarah about her day, not just checking for problems, but genuinely interested in the small developments and milestones she had observed. When Jake took his first tentative crawling movements, Thomas insisted on calling his grandmother to share the news, including Sarah in the excitement as if she were Jake's biological mother. The physical intimacy of their marriage remained undefined territory. They shared a house but not a bedroom, a legal bond but not yet an emotional one. Thomas was respectful to the point of being almost formal, never assuming privileges that hadn't been explicitly granted. Sarah appreciated his consideration, but it also created a strange tension, like living with a polite stranger who happened to be legally bound to her for life. One evening, Emma developed colic that nothing seemed to soothe. Sarah walked the floor for hours trying every trick Nana Rose had taught her, but the baby's cries only grew more desperate. When Thomas arrived home to find them both in tears, he didn't hesitate to take over, sending Sarah to take a shower while he attempted his own repertoire of calming techniques. She emerged from the bathroom 20 minutes later to find him sitting in the rocking chair, Emma finally quiet against his chest while he hummed an old song in the Modoc language. The sight of them together, this big man cradling such a small child with infinite gentleness, did something to her heart that she wasn't prepared for. "My mother used to sing that to me," he said quietly when he noticed her watching. "I never thought I'd remember all the words." That night, for the first time since their marriage, they talked past the baby's bedtime. Thomas told her about growing up on the reservation, about leaving for college and the culture shock of being one of only a handful of Native students. He spoke about meeting Maria at an intertribal gathering, how they had bonded over being caught between traditional and modern worlds. She helped me understand that I didn't have to choose, he said, his voice soft in the darkened living room. I could honor my heritage and still live in the contemporary world. She made me believe I could have both. Sarah shared her own stories, about growing up isolated on the mountain farm, about dreams of college and travel that had seemed impossible even before the marriage arrangement. She talked about books she had loved and places she hoped to see someday. Surprised to find that Thomas listened with genuine interest and asked thoughtful questions. Maybe when the children are older we could travel together, he suggested. There are places I'd like to show them, powwows and cultural sites where they can learn about their heritage. And places you've dreamed about seeing. The idea of a shared future, of planning beyond the immediate needs of infant care, felt both thrilling and terrifying. It suggested that this marriage might become something more than a practical arrangement, that they might actually build a life together, rather than simply coexisting for the sake of the children. But even as these moments of connection multiplied, Sarah remained aware of the fragile foundation their relationship was built on. Thomas still grieved for his first wife in ways both obvious and subtle. Sometimes she would catch him staring at photographs of Maria with an expression of loss so profound, it made her feel like an intruder. The babies themselves were constant reminders of the woman who had died bringing them into the world. During quiet afternoon hours when the babies napped, Sarah would sometimes sit in the nursery and try to imagine what Maria would have been like as a mother. The room still contained evidence of her preparations, from the carefully chosen paint colors to the mobile of traditional animals hanging over Jake's crib. Everything had been selected with love and hope by a woman who had expected to watch her children grow up in this space. 3 months into the marriage, Sarah realized she was no longer counting the days since leaving her parents' house. The rhythm of her new life had become natural, expected. She woke each morning knowing exactly what needed to be done and finding satisfaction in doing it well. The babies responded to her voice, her touch, her presence with the easy acceptance of children who felt secure and loved. But late at night, alone in her room with the sounds of the sleeping house around her, she would sometimes wonder if this growing contentment was enough. Was it possible to build a real marriage on practical foundations? Could love grow between two people who had been brought together by necessity rather than choice? And most challenging of all, could she learn to live with being someone's second choice, the woman who came after the great love of Thomas's life had ended? Winter arrived early that year, blanketing the reservation in snow that transformed the familiar landscape into something magical and severe. Sarah had never experienced cold quite like this, where the air itself seemed to crystallize and every breath created clouds of vapor. Thomas spent extra time each morning ensuring the heating system was working properly and that there was enough firewood stacked on the porch. The enforced intimacy of being snowed in together changed the dynamics of their household in subtle ways. Thomas began working from home more often, setting up a makeshift office in the living room where he could help with the babies between phone calls and paperwork. Sarah discovered he was patient with interruptions, often pausing mid-sentence during business calls to hand her a diaper or retrieve a dropped toy without any sign of frustration. Emma and Jake, now approaching their first birthdays, were becoming distinct individuals with clear preferences and personalities. Emma remained the calmer twin, content to sit and observe her surroundings with serious dark eyes that missed nothing. Jake was pure energy, pulling himself up on furniture and attempting to climb anything within reach. His adventurous spirit required constant supervision and baby-proofing that seemed to expand daily. He's going to be trouble. Nana Rose observed one snowy afternoon as Jake managed to reach a previously safe shelf and scatter its contents across the floor. That boy has the spirit of his great-grandfather, who once climbed to the top of the water tower just to see what was up there. The comment sparked something in Sarah's memory, a fragment of conversation she had overheard months earlier. That evening, after the babies were asleep, she asked Thomas about his family history. What she learned surprised her with its complexity and pain. Thomas's great-grandfather had been among the Modoc people forcibly removed from their ancestral lands in the 1870s. The family had lost everything in that relocation, but had slowly rebuilt their lives and connections to the land over generations. His grandfather had been a code talker during World War II, using the Modoc language to transmit military secrets. His father had been one of the first tribal members to earn a college degree, eventually becoming a teacher who helped establish the reservation school system. Each generation had to find their own way of being Modoc in a changing world, Thomas explained as they sat by the fire, the only light in the room coming from the flames and the soft glow from the baby monitor. My father taught me that survival isn't just about preserving traditions exactly as they were. It's about adapting those traditions so they remain meaningful for new circumstances. The conversation revealed layers of Thomas's character that Sarah had only glimpsed before. He spoke about the pressure he felt to honor his ancestors, while also providing his children with opportunities to succeed in the modern world. He worried that Emma and Jake would grow up feeling torn between cultures, never quite fitting into either the reservation community or the wider society beyond its boundaries. Maria understood that balance, he said quietly, his voice taking on the careful tone he always used when mentioning his first wife. She could move between both worlds without losing herself in either one. I hope she would teach that to our children. For the first time, Sarah felt bold enough to ask direct questions about Maria. What had she been like as a person, beyond the idealized version everyone seemed to remember? How had they met? And what had their marriage been like during the brief time they had together? Thomas was silent for so long that Sarah began to regret asking. But when he finally spoke, his words painted a picture that was both more human and more complex than she had expected. Maria had been strong-willed to the point of stubbornness, passionate about education and cultural preservation, but sometimes impatient with people who didn't share her vision. She had been working on a master's degree in Native American studies while teaching full-time, planning to eventually develop new curriculum materials for reservation schools. She could be demanding, Thomas admitted, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. She had very specific ideas about how things should be done, and she wasn't shy about correcting people who got it wrong. Some people found her intimidating, but I loved her certainty. She never doubted that she could make a difference. The contrast with her own personality wasn't lost on Sarah. Where Maria had been assertive and visionary, Sarah felt cautious and uncertain. Where Maria had possessed clear goals and the confidence to pursue them, Sarah was still discovering what she wanted from life beyond the immediate needs of caring for 2 babies. But as the winter deepened and their conversations continued, Sarah began to understand that Thomas's grief wasn't just about losing Maria. It was about losing the future they had planned together, the partnership they had been building, the shared vision of raising their children with strong cultural identity and unlimited possibilities. One particularly cold evening, Emma developed a high fever that wouldn't respond to the usual remedies. The reservation clinic was closed due to the storm, and the roads were too dangerous for travel to the hospital in town. Thomas paced the living room with Emma in his arms while Sarah called every contact number they had been given for medical emergencies. Finally reaching the on-call nurse practitioner, Sarah was walked through a series of treatments and monitoring steps. For the next 6 hours, she and Thomas took turns checking Emma's temperature, administering medication, and watching for signs of improvement or deterioration. Jake, picking up on the tension, became fussier than usual, requiring attention even as they focused on his sister. By morning, Emma's fever had broken, and she was sleeping peacefully. Thomas, exhausted from the night of worry, sat slumped in the rocking chair with Jake dozing against his chest. Sarah, equally tired, curled up on the couch with Emma, both of them finally able to rest. "We make a good team," Thomas said quietly, his voice rough with fatigue and emotion. "I couldn't have handled that alone." The acknowledgement meant more to Sarah than elaborate compliments might have. It was recognition that she had become essential to their family's functioning, not just as hired help, but as a true partner in the challenging work of raising children. The scared 18-year-old who had signed papers at the courthouse was being replaced by a woman who could handle medical emergencies, manage household crises, and provide the kind of steady support that families required. But the most significant change came a few days later, when Thomas knocked softly on Sarah's bedroom door after the babies were asleep. When she opened it, he stood in the hallway holding a small wrapped package, looking more nervous than she had ever seen him. "I know this isn't a real marriage in the way most people understand it," he began, his words carefully chosen, "but you've become more important to me and to the children than I expected when we made this arrangement. I wanted you to have something that belonged to my family, if you're willing to accept it." Inside the package was a necklace of intricate silver work set with turquoise stones. clearly old and obviously precious. Thomas explained that it had belonged to his great-grandmother, passed down through generations of women who had worn it during important ceremonies and family celebrations. Maria never wore it, he said quietly. She said it should wait for the right moment, the right occasion. I think she would approve of you having it now. As Sarah fastened the necklace around her throat, she felt the weight of more than just silver and stone. She was being offered inclusion in a family history that stretched back generations, acceptance as more than just a temporary solution to an immediate problem. The necklace was beautiful, but it was also a statement of intention, a suggestion that their arrangement might be evolving into something neither of them had originally planned. That night, for the first time since their marriage, Thomas kissed her goodnight with something that felt like genuine affection rather than mere politeness. It was still cautious, still respectful of boundaries they hadn't yet negotiated, but it carried a warmth that had been missing from their earlier interactions. As Sarah prepared for bed, she caught sight of herself in the mirror, wearing the family necklace. The woman looking back at her had changed dramatically over the past months. She looked older, more confident, more settled in her own skin. She looked like someone who belonged somewhere, who had found her place in the world even if it hadn't been the place she had originally imagined for herself. Outside, the snow continued to fall, sealing them into their warm house with its sleeping babies and its slowly evolving sense of what family might mean. Sarah was beginning to understand that love could indeed grow in unexpected soil, nurtured by shared responsibility, mutual respect, and the daily choice to care for each other's well-being. Whether that would be enough to build a lasting marriage remained to be seen, but for the first time since leaving her childhood home, she felt hopeful about what the future might hold. Spring arrived with a suddenness that caught everyone off guard, transforming the snow-covered reservation into a landscape of mud, budding trees, and the irrepressible energy of renewal. Emma and Jake celebrated their first birthday with a small party that brought together extended family and close friends, marking not just their survival of a difficult first year, but Sarah's successful integration into the community. The changes in the twins were remarkable. Emma had developed into a thoughtful observer who could sit quietly for long periods, studying faces and objects with the intensity of a scientist. She had begun saying her first words, calling Thomas Dada, and Sarah something that sounded like Mama, but might have been coincidence. Jake, meanwhile, had achieved full mobility, and used it to explore every corner of their world with the fearless curiosity of a natural adventurer. Sarah found herself thinking less about her old life and more about the future she was building with Thomas and the children. The daily routines that had once felt strange and imposed had become natural rhythms that structured her days in satisfying ways. She had developed genuine friendships with several women in the community, relationships based on shared experiences of motherhood and mutual respect, rather than the polite distance of early acquaintance. But it was her evolving relationship with Thomas that surprised her most. What had begun as careful coexistence had gradually transformed into something that felt like genuine partnership. They had developed an easy communication about household matters, shared decision-making about the children, and a comfortable physical presence around each other that no longer required constant navigation of boundaries. The shift had been so gradual that Sarah couldn't pinpoint exactly when it happened, but sometime during the winter months Thomas had begun touching her casually. A hand on her shoulder when he passed behind her chair, fingers briefly intertwined when they both reached for the same toy, his arm around her waist when they stood together watching the children play. These touches felt natural rather than calculated, the unconscious intimacy of people who had learned to trust each other. One evening in late spring, as they worked together to prepare the garden plot behind their house, Thomas brought up a subject that had been hovering unspoken between them for months. "I've been thinking about our sleeping arrangements," he said, his attention focused on the soil he was turning with deliberate care. "The guest room was always meant to be temporary until you felt comfortable here. But it's been almost a year, and I don't want you to feel like you have to stay separate if you'd rather not." The conversation was awkward in the way that important discussions often are, full of pauses and careful word choices. But it was also honest, acknowledging that their marriage had evolved beyond its original purely practical boundaries. They were no longer strangers bound together only by legal papers and mutual need. They had become something more complex, something that deserved its own definition. Sarah found herself thinking about intimacy in ways she never had before. Her experience with men was limited to schoolgirl crushes and the theoretical knowledge gleaned from books and whispered conversations with friends. But Thomas represented something different, a man who had already proven his capacity for commitment, responsibility, and gentle strength. The idea of physical intimacy with him didn't frighten her the way she had expected it might. "I'd like that," she said quietly, her own attention focused on the seeds she was planting in neat rows. "Moving to your room, I mean, if you're sure." The transition happened gradually over the next week, with Sarah moving her belongings a few items at a time, until the guest room stood empty, and her clothes hung beside Thomas's in the master bedroom closet. The first few nights were marked by careful politeness, each of them staying on their own side of the large bed, but even that distance felt warmer than the separation they had maintained for so many months. Physical intimacy, when it finally happened, was nothing like the dramatic scenes Sarah had read about in novels. It was tentative and considerate, marked more by Thomas's careful attention to her comfort than by overwhelming passion. But it was also meaningful in ways she hadn't anticipated, creating a bond between them that went beyond shared responsibility for the children. "I never expected to feel this way again," Thomas admitted one morning as they lay in the early dawn light, listening to the sounds of the babies stirring in the nursery down the hall. "After Maria died, I thought that part of my life was over." His honesty about his first wife no longer stung the way it once had. Sarah had come to understand that his love for Maria didn't diminish his growing affection for her. People were capable of loving more than once, of building new relationships without betraying old ones. Maria would always be the mother of his children and his first love, but Sarah was becoming something equally valuable in her own right. The community seemed to sense the change in their relationship, treating them more like a genuine couple and less like a practical arrangement. Invitations began arriving for social events that included both of them, and people stopped being quite so careful about mentioning Maria in Sarah's presence. She was no longer the temporary solution to Thomas's childcare problem. She was his wife, accepted and respected in her own right. Summer brought new challenges and opportunities. Thomas's construction business was thriving, requiring longer hours and more travel to job sites. Sarah found herself managing the household and children independently for longer periods, a responsibility that would have terrified her a year earlier but now felt well within her. Capabilities. The babies were developing distinct personalities that delighted and challenged their parents in different ways. Emma showed early signs of her father's careful, methodical approach to problems, while Jake displayed a creative curiosity that led him into constant mischief. Sarah found herself mediating between a cautious child who preferred familiar routines and an adventurous one who treated every day as an opportunity for new discoveries. One particularly busy day, when both children were cranky from the heat and Thomas was dealing with a crisis at a job site, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Her mother arrived without warning, driving the same old pickup truck that had been barely running when Sarah left home over a year ago. The reunion was emotional and complicated, full of tears and apologies and careful questions about how Sarah's new life was treating her. Her mother looked older, more worn by the struggles that had led to Sarah's marriage arrangement. But there was also relief in her face as she observed the comfortable home and healthy children that surrounded her daughter. "I worried we had made a terrible mistake," her mother admitted as she held Emma, who had warmed up to this new grandmother with typical baby adaptability. "Your father and I have regretted it every day since you left. But seeing you now, seeing how you've grown and what you've built here, I think maybe everything happened the way it was supposed to." The visit lasted 3 days, during which Sarah's mother got to know Thomas and the children, while observing the life her daughter had created on the reservation. She was impressed by Thomas's obvious devotion to his family, the respect he showed Sarah, and the way he included her in all decisions about the children and household. But it was a private conversation between the two women that proved most revealing. Sarah's mother had brought news about the family farm, which was now stable and profitable thanks to the debt relief provided by Sarah's marriage arrangement. More importantly, she brought an apology for the circumstances that had led to that arrangement. "We should have found another way," she said, as they sat on the porch while the children napped and Thomas worked in his shop. "You deserve the chance to choose your own husband, your own life. Instead, we forced you into this situation because we were desperate and scared." Sarah's response surprised them both. "I was angry about that for a long time," she acknowledged. "But I'm not angry anymore. You did what you thought was best with the options you had. And honestly, I might never have been brave enough to choose something like this for myself. Sometimes the best things in life come from paths we never planned to take." The conversation marked a turning point in Sarah's understanding of her own story. She was no longer the victim of circumstances beyond her control. She had become an active participant in shaping her own life, making choices and compromises that reflected her growing maturity and commitment to the family she had helped create. When her mother left, promising to visit again soon, and extending invitations for Sarah and the family to come to the farm, Sarah felt a sense of completion that had been missing since her marriage began. She was no longer caught between two worlds, no longer wondering if she belonged in either place. She had found her home, built her family, and proven to herself that she was capable of far more than anyone, including herself, had originally believed. 2 years had passed since that frightened 18-year-old girl had stood in a courthouse and married a stranger. The woman who now moved confidently through the reservation community bore little resemblance to that earlier version of herself. Sarah had grown into her role as wife and mother with a grace that surprised everyone, including herself. Emma and Jake, now energetic 3-year-olds, showed no signs of missing the mother they had never known. To them, Sarah was simply Mama, the person who kissed their scraped knees, read bedtime stories in funny voices, and knew exactly how to make everything better when the world seemed too big or scary. Their attachment to her was complete and natural, built on thousands of small moments of care and attention. The revelation came on an ordinary Tuesday morning in autumn, when Sarah was helping Nana Rose prepare vegetables for the community harvest feast. The older woman had been quieter than usual, her weathered hands moving slowly as she worked. Finally, she set down her knife and looked directly at Sarah. "There's something I need to tell you about Thomas and Maria," she said, her voice carrying the weight of a secret that had been held too long. "Something the family decided you should never know, but I think you have a right to understand the truth." Sarah's hands stilled on the squash she had been peeling. Over the past 2 years, she had occasionally wondered about the gaps in the story she had been told. The way certain conversations would stop when she entered a room, the careful way people spoke about Maria's death. "Maria didn't die from complications during childbirth," Nana Rose continued, her eyes fixed on her hands. "She died by suicide 3 days after the babies were born. Postpartum depression hit her so hard and so fast that she couldn't see any way through it. She left a letter saying she was afraid she would hurt the children, that they would be better off without her." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, rearranging everything she thought she understood about Thomas's grief, the community's protective attitude toward the children, and her own place in this family's history. "The family decided to say it was medical complications," Nana Rose explained. "They wanted to protect the children from that knowledge, and they were afraid the truth would make it harder to find someone willing to help raise them." Thomas agreed to the story, but he's carried the guilt and shame of it ever since. Sarah set down the squash with trembling hands. "Does he know you're telling me this?" "He doesn't know, but he needs to. That man has been carrying this burden alone for too long, afraid that if people knew the truth, they would think he failed as a husband. He's been afraid to fully love you because he thinks he doesn't deserve another chance at happiness." The conversation explained so much about Thomas's behavior over the past 2 years. His careful emotional distance even as their physical relationship had developed. His occasional moments of inexplicable sadness that seemed to come from nowhere. His reluctance to make long-term plans, as if he were afraid to hope for too much happiness. That evening, after the children were asleep, Sarah approached the subject with the gentle directness she had learned was most effective with Thomas. They sat together on the couch where they had shared so many quiet conversations over the years, and she simply told him what Nana Rose had revealed. Thomas's reaction was everything she had expected and more. Shame, guilt, and a bone-deep fear that she would see him differently now that she knew the truth about Maria's death. He had convinced himself that he had failed his first wife so completely that he didn't deserve the happiness he had found with Sarah. She was brilliant and strong and full of plans for the future, he said, his voice breaking. But after the babies came, she became someone I didn't recognize. Scared, desperate, convinced that she was going to harm them somehow. I tried to help, tried to get her to talk to someone, but she hid how bad it was getting. The letter Maria had left behind, which Thomas had never shown anyone, revealed a woman in the grip of a mental illness that had distorted her perception of reality. She had been convinced that the babies would be better off without her, that Thomas would find someone more capable of loving them properly. In her final act, she had asked Thomas to promise that he would find the children a good mother who could give them the love she felt incapable of providing. "I made that promise," Thomas said quietly. "And when I saw you with Emma and Jake that first day, when I watched you calm Emma's crying and make Jake smile, I thought maybe Maria had somehow sent you to us. But I've been afraid to fully believe it, afraid to trust that this happiness is real and lasting." Sarah's heart broke for the man who had carried this secret for so long, who had blamed himself for something that was beyond anyone's control. She understood now why the community had been so protective, why they had been cautious about accepting her initially. They had been guarding not just against another loss, but against the truth that could have destroyed the family's carefully maintained stability. But she also understood that secrets, even well-intentioned ones, created their own kinds of damage. Thomas had been living with unnecessary guilt, and she had been building a relationship on an incomplete foundation. The truth was painful, but it was also liberating. "You didn't fail her," Sarah said firmly, taking his face in her hands and forcing him to meet her eyes. "Mental illness isn't something you can love away or fix through pure effort. You were dealing with something that required professional help, and sometimes even that isn't enough." The conversation that followed was the most honest they had ever had. Thomas talked about the signs he had missed, the help he had tried to get, the horrible morning when he had found Maria's letter and realized what had happened. Sarah shared her own fears about living up to an idealized memory, her struggles with feeling like a replacement rather than a choice. "You were never a replacement," Thomas said with a conviction that surprised her. "You became something I never expected to find again. A partner. A real partner who chose to build this life with me even when it was difficult and uncertain." The revelation changed something fundamental between them. With the truth finally spoken, Thomas seemed to shed a burden he had carried for too long. He became more present, more willing to make plans for their future, more open about his feelings for Sarah and his gratitude for the life they had built together. The children, blissfully unaware of the adult complications surrounding their origins, continued to thrive in the security of a loving home. Emma showed signs of her mother's intelligence, but with a stability that spoke to the consistent care she had received. Jake's adventurous spirit was balanced by a deep sense of belonging that came from being raised by parents who delighted in his discoveries. As autumn deepened into winter once again, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this place. The frightened girl who had been given away at 18 had become a woman who chose to stay, to love, to build something lasting from the most unlikely beginnings. Standing in the kitchen of the home that now truly felt like hers, watching Thomas help the children with a puzzle while dinner simmered on the stove, Sarah understood that love could indeed grow anywhere if it was tended with patience and honesty. She had found her place not by accident or arrangement, but through the daily choice to open her heart to whatever came next. The secret that had finally been revealed hadn't destroyed their family. Instead, it had completed their understanding of how precious and fragile happiness could be, and how important it was to protect and nurture the love they had discovered together. Emma and Jake would grow up knowing they were wanted and cherished, surrounded by a community that would help them understand their complex heritage and support them through whatever challenges life might bring. And Sarah, who had started this journey as someone else's solution to a problem, had become exactly what she had never dared to dream she could be. A woman who had found her home, her purpose, and her own unexpected version of happiness in the last place anyone, including herself, had thought to look for it.